Well, greetings, everyone, and welcome to the Harvard Catholic Forum. I am Deacon Tim O'Donnell, Program Director here, and I'm delighted to welcome you, both those with us in person here at St. Paul's in Harvard Square, and our virtual audience joining us through Zoom. Tonight we continue a series of public lectures which engage a theme that has both enduring and pressing significance: human work and its relation to faith. Work. This is actually what most of us will spend most of our lives doing compared with anything else. Work, that is, understood in its total reality, not just a job for a paycheck, but taking care of others, household work, and tasks that we take on as volunteers. Let me begin by saying a few brief words about the Harvard Catholic Forum. Our mission is to share the riches of Catholic thought and culture with the academic, artistic, and professional worlds of Cambridge, Boston, and beyond. In addition to our lectures, we offer non-credit courses and are continuing to broaden our programming. The Forum is a project of the Harvard Catholic Center, St. Paul's Parish in Harvard Square, and the St. Paul's Choir School. Together we make up a vibrant Catholic presence in the midst of the Harvard campus. Check out our website at www.harvardcatholicforum.org, where you can sign up for our newsletters and register for future events. And please consider supporting our important mission by making a financial contribution there. We are honored to have as our lead co-sponsor for this series the Theology of Work Project, an ecumenical effort founded in 2007 by Protestant scholars and ministers. This international research and publishing organization has produced a commentary on the entire Bible from the perspective of work. More, they have gathered resources for scholars, for people who work in ministry, and for all who face the challenge of working every day in the light of faith. I urge you to check them out at theologyofwork.org. And last week we welcomed their executive director, William Messenger, to offer the first talk in our series on Christian perspectives on work. Who needs it? This talk is recorded on YouTube and archived at harvardcatholicforum.org. We're also thankful for the co-sponsorship of the Lumen Christi Institute at the University of Chicago and the Human Flourishing Program at Harvard's Institute for Quantitative Social Science. So please note, this event, like last week's, will be archived on the Harvard Catholic Forum YouTube channel. If you like what you see and hear, please share the link to that channel with friends, colleagues, parishes, or chaplaincies that may be interested. Our post-talk YouTube participation usually exceeds the numbers we are able to reach on day one by a great margin. Before I introduce our speaker, let me give you a roadmap of tonight's event. The lecture segment will last 30 minutes or so, and then we will have an opportunity for some Q&A. Those of you who are here in person should have received a note card and pencil when you came in. If you have a question, please write it on the card. At about 7:50, some of our student fellows will come up the aisles to collect the cards and bring them to me. I will pass on as many of the questions as I can. Unfortunately, we are not set up technically to take questions from our virtual audience at the same time. Our speaker tonight is Thomas Kohler, concurrent professor of law and philosophy at Boston College Law School, and an internationally recognized authority on labor law. He has written and lectured widely on issues in Catholic social thought and held guest professorships and lectureships throughout the U.S., as well as in Europe and Japan. A graduate of Yale Law School, Professor Kohler has published numerous articles and acted as advisor to government entities, nonprofits, and church leaders. His forthcoming book is entitled Solidarity Forever: The Story and Significance of an Idea from Yale University Press. Please join me in welcoming Thomas Kohler, who explores what Catholic social thought can teach us about work.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here tonight. And before I start, I wanted to remember a couple of men. First is Monsignor Dennis Sheehan, who died about a year ago. Dennis was the longtime pastor of this parish and somebody who meant a great deal to me and my family. The second is Thomas Levergood. Thomas was the executive director and really the genius behind the Lumen Christi Institute at the University of Chicago. He was a singular man. I've never met anybody like him. I don't think I ever will again. He did great service for the church, great service for the intellectual apostolate. And as a good friend, I will miss him. I am doing this tonight in part because Thomas had asked me to get involved with this wonderful project, and in part because I owe him so much. So with that as a start, let me talk a little bit about what I'm planning to do tonight. And I don't know if I'm going to use the entire 30 minutes. I was talking to a colleague of mine 2 days ago who is Germany's and Europe's leading scholar on Catholic social thought. She's a professor at the University of Freiburg. And I said, you know, I've always wondered, is there some nice, short, tight definition of Catholic social thought? And she laughed and said, you know, I know the problem you're talking about, but she said there really isn't one. So what I'm going to do tonight is, first of all, start with, before launching into my theme, I want to talk a little bit about what Catholic social thought is, how we should think about it. I then want to talk about the history of Catholic social thought, not the entire history, because we'd be here for weeks, but a little bit of orientation, and then I want to move to some of the insights that the social tradition has on work. I'm hoping that you'll have questions. I'm hoping you'll have comments. As a law professor, I don't lecture as much as I pose questions and try to do things Socratically. So don't let me down. Please feel free to ask questions. I'm looking forward to them. So let's start with what Catholic social thought is or might be. And what I'm trying to do here is just kind of giving a framing concept. I'm doing this because I don't know about you, but it seems to me that people are forever citing Catholic social thought as the basis for whatever position it is that they are trying to argue for, regardless of what their position is and almost regardless of topic. So whether it's matters like same-sex marriage, market regulation, tax policy, vaccination requirements at work, the death penalty, work, immigration, regardless of the topic and somebody's view of it, it seems that they often will invoke, even if they're not Catholic, Catholic social thought as backing their position. It's sometimes been said that Catholic social thought is the greatest, best kept secret of the church. I don't think that's quite accurate. I think the term Catholic social thought is pretty well known, but what it consists in is, I think, a lot less known. So let's think for a couple of minutes about, or let me talk for a couple of minutes about what it is. And if I were to give it in one sentence, I'd say this. Catholic social thought stands as a reflection on the proper ordering of society. So when it says social thought, that's what it's really talking about, but it's an architectonic thing. What would a proper ordering of a society look like? That leads to some of its indeterminacy. and its feline flexibility, if you will. As Lord Wedderburn once said of the principle of subsidiarity, which of course is a Catholic principle. So the elements of this, and the thing that Catholic social thought has spoken about amongst many other things, are the basic elements of society, such as the family, such as communities, political orders, economic orders, and the myriad institutions that make up a society. How should they be ordered? How should we think about them? We can get a taste of this from the English subtitle of one of the great social encyclicals in the social thought tradition. And that was Pius XI's Quadragesimo Anno that was published in 1931. The title itself means 40 years after. It was 40 years after the first encyclical in this tradition, Rerum Novarum. The subtitle of Quadragesimo Anno was On the Reconstruction of the Social Order. Most of that encyclical talked about the ordering of work and the ordering of, it was a corporatist order that would have ordered work and all economic, or suggested an order of work and all economic institutions within a society. We can leave that where it is, but this emphasis on a proper ordering is the thing that the social thought tradition is really reflected on. What lies behind all of the Catholic social thought tradition is a particular anthropology, that is, an understanding of the person and what sorts of arrangements conduce to the flourishing of human beings. The human always stands at the center of this tradition. It's always a set of reflections upon what would best conduce to setting the order that would allow humans to act in the most truly human fashion possible. The anthropology that the Catholic social thought tradition stands on is at odds with almost everything that modernity teaches us. There have been various efforts at a syncretism of postmodern thought or modern thought and Catholic social thought. I don't think those work too well for one reason. The anthropology truly is different. Catholic social thought understands humans as inherently social. So the American style individualism, the sort of thing Tocqueville worried so much about, is very foreign to the way the social thought tradition approaches things. It sees humans as inherently social and ultimately situated to one another by bonds of obligation. So the social thought tradition takes Christ's adjuration that you are your brother's keeper very seriously. The great command from Sirach, which is of course repeated in Matthew, John, and in other places, Christ himself said this sums up everything. Love God with your whole mind, your whole heart, and your whole soul. And the second, love your neighbor as yourself. So what Catholic social thought is going to try to do in various ways over a long period of time is to think about basing society on love. That's really the trick. And of course, that's the sort of thing that we don't think in post-Enlightenment thought is really much of a possibility. The ancients thought that all societies had to be based on a specifically political sort of friendship. All the moderns think that that's an impossibility. The great historian, church historian, John Bossy, in his lovely book, The Christian Church, 1400 to 1700, said the following, and I think it is a wonderful way of summing some of this up, although he was not talking about Catholic social thought when he said this. The state of charity, meaning social integration, was the principal end of Christian life. And any people who claimed to be Christian had to embody that somehow at some time in the world. So there you have it. That's what Catholic social thought is grounded in. That is the basis from which it proceeds. That anthropology also sees humans as reasonable beings and therefore capable of true self-determination. Every human is capable of doing this, at least potentially. A well-ordered society is set up in a fashion to permit, to the greatest extent possible, support to allow people to do this, to engage in acts of self-determination and to engage in knowing. That's really a key aspect of all of this. So the individualistic, self-sovereign, self-seeking being portrayed by modernity, a view that takes a voluntaristic view of humans, that instrumentalizes reason, that sees reason as subject to the passions and something that can't get beyond it. As the great political theorist Leo Strauss once put it, a world of retail rationality and wholesale lunacy, meaning that reason could figure out how to get what you wanted, how to get what passions tell you you want, but stands mute before the question, is it good or not? The question of is it's good or not to modernity can't be answered. This takes a very different approach. So with that as a basis, that is a very quick summary of what this is based on. Let's turn to the history and development of Catholic social thought. I think to get some sense of why the social thought tradition concentrates so much attention on work, it helps to have some sense of how, when, and why the social thought tradition developed. Now, some will take this back much earlier than I will, but those reflections are really on the political order, going back to things like the investiture controversy that you probably last read about in ninth grade, unless you took European history, the split of the Orbis Christianus and the separation of church and state, which Ernst Wolfgang Birkenförde points out was something that the church argued for, not the state originally. All of that goes well beyond what I have time to address tonight. If you ask most people when the social thought tradition starts, in fact, I just saw a brand new book talking about a figure in this tradition, saying that it starts with Leo XIII. It doesn't. Some will go back a little bit further and talk about Bishop von Kettler, the great workers' bishop of Mainz, who lived from 1811 to 1877. Whom Leo called his great predecessor. None of that's true. Catholic social thought begins in the wake of the French Revolution. Why? Why in the wake of the French Revolution? As Francois Furet points out, the most famous night in French constitutional history was August the 4th, 1789. Now this might seem a long way from work, but I can guarantee you it is directly connected to it. On that night, the National Assembly declared that, quote, it entirely destroys the feudal regime. Okay, so what does that mean? With that audacious act, Furet points out, the venerable social structures that made up society and anchored one's place in the world simply collapsed. There was no society any longer. So the corps, the orders, the guilds, the journeymen's associations, the religious institutions, all of that was swept away. So on that night, you have this act saying, all right, the new Adam has arrived. The problem, of course, becomes now that you have a world of free, sovereign, and equal individuals, as Tocqueville pointed out, the problem is, without a common bond to hold them together, in what will society consist? That argument, how to hold people together, what constitutes a society, what puts a society together, is a question that has been on the forefront of politics since that time. Of course, we've had all sorts of answers or suggested answers to that. This becomes what the social tradition has called the social question. So if you read in this area, you'll see that term coming up a lot, or the term workers' question. They seem synonymous, they're not quite. So as Burke put it, in the wake of the revolution, what would bind people? The social question, the term itself, is a question that Napoleon suggested. The theorist Robert Castell described the social question as the fundamental aporia on which society tests the enigma of its cohesion and tries to avoid the risk of its fracture. As you can see, if you look at the United States today, that social question's a pretty pressing question. What's going to hold us together? Among the first to respond to this question in the wake of the French Revolution were Catholic social thinkers. Now, they didn't call themselves social thinkers at that time. They saw themselves as religious activists responding to a great exigency. What comes next? To boil a lot down into a few words, amongst the social structures to go, and some of the most significant, were the old relationships of master and servant, which had bilateral duties, the journeymen's associations, the sworn trades, as they were called, etc. The Loi des Chapeliers was one of the most important laws that was passed in this time. It forbade any sort of worker association. It required that all workers as individuals individually contract for their terms with their masters. But of course, with this, you also have the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. As Adam Smith points out in the 3rd chapter of The Wealth of Nations, master and servant are bound by mutual need. They need one another. But the need of the servant is much greater than the need of the capitalist, because by definition, the servant doesn't have the money. In Germany, along with this sort of thing, in 1820 in Prussia, there was a so-called freeing of the peasants, the Bauernbefreiung. With all of these changes, people who once were embedded in communities, where, for example, if you were living on the estate and working as, they had all sorts of terms for the people who worked on the estates, they were free, they weren't bound vassals or something. But the master had the duty to take care of them. So if their hut was falling down, the master had to rebuild it. If you got sick, he had to take care of you, etc. All of that was gone. Many people couldn't afford the land, so they start moving to the cities. Many people who could afford the land didn't understand how to use credit, so they quickly got themselves into trouble. A rising middle class started to buy them out, so you had this massive movement of people into the cities. With that movement into the cities came also the problem of, and the entry to the trades had been removed, so the requirements that you do it in apprenticeship, etc., had been removed. You had massive numbers of people who simply could not sustain themselves. The social question, in part, is the question of, all right, how do we take care of all these people? But it quickly became seen as the worker question. So let me talk a little bit about this. These people who now were filling the cities, and who Franz von Baader, 15 years before Marx used the term, termed them the proletariat, referring to the Roman term. The proles had only their children. They had nothing else as wealth. Similarly with these people. They had no place in society. They had no legal rights. They had no place to stand in the society. They were simply on the edge of society with no political, no legal standing. They also, of course, were at great precarious economic status. Many of them were employed on a day-to-day basis. Of course, with this you have massive poverty, massive social instability. Responding to this were a number of Catholic thinkers. J.E.S. Hayward, who was a great political theorist, an English political theorist, said that the whole question of solidarity was first responded to by Catholic thinkers. Catholic thinkers, he said, are really the ones who anchored this, and this is the tradition from which Catholic social thought develops. It was quite an assorted group of people. The Abbé Lamennais, who was one of the most interesting and important political figures of his time, a priest who was, one pope was going to make a cardinal and the other threatened with excommunication, so you can tell he was a problematic figure. Adam Müller, Franz von Baader, Franz von Buss, the members of the Munich Romantic Circle, all of these people began to respond to this by writing about how this social situation might be responded to. Most of them were laymen. German Romanticism played an especially important role here, and this is a funny thing, because Leo XIII was very worried about German Romanticism affecting Catholic theology. This is at the end of the 19th century. But if it hadn't been for Romanticism, the Catholic social thought movement never would have developed. So, in a way, he was cutting off his nose to spite his face. He didn't know how these two things came together. The focus of the work of these early Catholic social thinkers was always the same. How can we recreate some sort of mediating institutions, associations, communities, workers' associations? How can we ground people back in a society and give them the bonds necessary so that they can flourish? And at the same time, how should we order work so that they have a decent life and an ability to sustain themselves in dignity? As you can see, these are quite complicated questions, and much of the 19th century was spent by, again, I emphasize this, mostly laymen, mostly Catholics, responding to this question, acting out of or writing out of that anthropology that I talked about at the beginning of this talk. There are two key concepts that come out of this. The first is solidarity. Solidarity is a new word. It really came into the language after the French Revolution. It was a borrowed term from Roman law. The Roman legal term is an obligatio in solidum. That is, it indicates something where a group is either liable for or entitled to the whole of a debt. It's inseparable. So the idea of solidarity is we're in this together. Solidarity becomes really the modern term for what the ancients called political friendship. Solidarity indicates really friendship. It indicates a willingness to work with others. It is evocative of an attitude of cooperation and an attitude that sees that one has obligations to others that cannot be dismissed. Subsidiarity is a key concept that really is an outgrowth of solidarity. Subsidiarity, as Americans think of it often, if they think of it at all, is usually in terms of what I call ratchet down federalism, push duties down to the lowest level. That's not subsidiarity. Subsidiarity says what an individual can accomplish, no larger group should do. What a small group could accomplish, no greater body should do. In each case, you're trying to give the individual or the small group as much ability as possible to make decisions for themselves. Along with that, though, is the obligation of the larger community to sustain the smaller or the individual when he or she cannot do the work themselves. By the end of the 19th century, the late 1860s, Kohler, who I mentioned, was the first Catholic member of the hierarchy, to start writing on these issues. He's familiar with all these developments. In fact, he was part of the circles that developed them. He starts to write on this. By 1891, Leo XIII wrote the first social encyclical, Rerum Novarum. This is often seen as the start of the social tradition, as I said, but of course, as I've just indicated, it has a much longer history. The funny thing about Rerum Novarum is that it was spectacularly successful. The reception to this was unbelievable. Rerum Novarum, the English title is On the Condition of Workers. The New York Times republished the entire encyclical in a special section. The American Economics Association had in 1893 an entire meeting devoted simply to what Rerum Novarum had to say. There were conferences everywhere. People paid a great deal of attention to this. That is the first of the encyclicals. The second comes about 40 years later, as I mentioned, Quadragesimo Anno in 1931. Then there's an interruption in these series. World War II, of course, breaks out. After World War II, Pius XII spent a fair amount of time on political considerations and the church's teachings on those. When John XXIII becomes Pope, there's a shift, and the shift is in a much more sociological direction. For a while, it looked like Catholic social thought wasn't going to have anything new to say about work. That changed with the papacy of John Paul II. Of course, he writes three really important encyclicals on work. The first is Laborem Exercens in 1981. The second was Solicitudo Rei Socialis in the later 80s, and then in 1991, Centesimus Annus. So that's a little bit about how this thing develops, who was behind it. Let's turn to the question of what exactly does Catholic social thought have to say about work? Well, as mentioned at the start, work and workers were always a central part of Catholic social thought. As Tim started off by saying, most people spend most of their time working. One of the insights of the social tradition, but of course it's not exclusive to it, is that humans are self-constituting beings. We make ourselves to be what we are through what we habitually do. Well, for most of us, what we habitually do is work. Therefore, if you really want to pay attention to human flourishing and the sorts of conditions that will either conduce to or detract from human self-determination, work's a pretty darn good place to start. Now, from the very start, as I said, the social tradition has always been interested in the creation of communities. So from the very first, Catholic social thought has supported the formation of unions, workers' associations of all sorts. This is to do two things. First, it's the creation of a community. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. The second thing is, this is quite realistic stuff. It realizes that individuals have no power unless they can present demands in a collective, concerted fashion. Because this is an effective way of doing it, the social tradition has, from the very start, supported the idea of unions. That doesn't mean that everything a union does it supports. That's a different question. Okay. Part of this, of course, is sustaining ourselves properly to ground families. Work grounds communities. It heightens our potential for self-determination. I want to turn to Laborem Exercens to talk a little bit about some of the themes that John Paul II sounds there. He sounds it in very modern-sounding language, but the insights are ancient, and they pick up from the whole social tradition. the loveliest phrases he's got. And a lot of this, by the way, came from his colleague, Joseph Tischner. Tischner was a Dominican, a political philosopher in Lublin, in Poland. He was the chief advisor to the Solidarity trade movement, of course, the movement that brought down the Soviet Union eventually. JP2 taught, and as I say, I love this, work is for man, man is not for work. We switch the way we normally think of things. We're not thinking about human inputs. We're thinking about what the human does and how what she does is the work appropriate to human dignity. The human is, as he also said, the subject of work. It's not the work that's the subject. It's the human subject doing the work that really needs to be the focus. Work is, as he taught, the human is the true maker and creator of work. So he emphasizes a constant theme in the social tradition: the priority of labor over capital, the priority of persons over things. Now, one of the things that most distinguishes American labor law from the labor law of other countries is that we put an emphasis on capital mobility. Everybody else puts an emphasis on employment stability. We think the most important thing is capital going in its Pareto optimal place. Countries that have more influence from the social thought tradition think the first thing we have to pay attention to is the stability of people in their jobs, because if it's unstable, it destabilizes the elements of society, families, etc. It also destabilizes the political situation, as World War II demonstrated so nicely for us. The third thing it does is that it prevents the person from unfolding their personality. The German Constitution guarantees the right to the unfolding of the personality, the human personality. Court holdings there say the place that you do this is work. So in their labor law, paying attention to the conditions under which one unfolds one's personality at work become the central focus. It's a very different way of thinking about things. The 19th century Polish poet, Romantic poet, Cyprian Norwid, put it wonderfully. As he said, beauty is to enthuse us for work, and the purpose of work is to raise us up. Now, what does he mean by that? I'll talk about that in a couple of minutes. But there's a transitive quality to work that itself represents solidarity. But before getting there, the tradition also, and all of this encyclicals in this tradition, and all of the writers on which this tradition is based, put an emphasis on what I call the creation of structures of solidarity. Social and economic life is certainly like a system, as John Paul II put it in Centesimus Annus, of connected vessels. All of these things are connected together. Every social activity, he said, had to be directed towards safeguarding the rights of particular groups and should adapt itself to this system. Similarly, he said, apart from the family, other intermediate communities, so churches, unions, all sorts of other communities, exercise primary functions and give life to the specific networks of solidarity. These had to be paid attention to. These develop as real communities of persons, JP2 wrote, and strengthen the social fabric, preventing society from becoming an anonymous and impersonal mass. A key element of these structures, as I mentioned, is workers' associations, unions of all sorts. They are a key part, the tradition has always taught, of a properly oriented society. Another aspect to this, and then I'll come to an end of these short remarks, is something about work as an axis of solidarity itself. This is an insight from Joseph Tischner. Work creates solidarity, and it does so in two ways. Of course, we work for ourselves in a particular fashion, but the work that we do is always for other people. The services that we do always have somebody else in mind. That creates a form of horizontal solidarity. We need one another. As Aristotle said in the Politics, you can't have a society simply of shoemakers or of physicians. You need all sorts of people working together. So that is an example of solidarity, but there's also vertical solidarity. What I know comes from eons of law professors, legal scholars ahead of me. My wife's a geneticist. All the science that was done prior to her becoming a scientist herself is part of what she inherits. We inherit these traditions. So there's a network of vertical solidarity. We also hand on what we know, what we've created, what we do to the generation that comes behind us. So this idea, as Tishner says, work itself creates a communion. That's a big term in the social thought tradition, and obviously it's a big term in the Catholic tradition as well. Properly ordered work can bring us into solidarity with our authentic selves and with the qualities that most constitute us as a human. Work constitutes the foundation for the formation of family life, as the encyclicals constantly point out, which is a natural right, something that men are called to. Through the reciprocal character of work, one also enters what JP2 called the labor of others, both within the family and within the society in which the family is embedded. Work represents an expression of the naturally intersubjective character of human beings. A rightly ordered culture of work is prior to, both temporally and in terms of significance, to key social institutions like the family and like the individual, that sets the conditions for both. So what JP2 talked about, what Tishner would talk about, is making a culture that's more truly human. So let me finish this by talking about two things that separate traditionally Jewish and Catholic attitudes from what you normally see, and particularly in modernity. How we regard work and how we regard community. Work reflects our character of being made in the image of God, the imago Dei. The rabbis teach, and of course the Catholics inherit this tradition, that of course God begins creation, but man alone, the rabbis taught, is given the great honor and the great dignity, the unique privilege of participating in the completion of creation. We are doing that by what we do on a regular basis. Adam Smith and the moderns all teach that work is an instrumental thing. It's not instrumental in these traditions. You're doing something that's far more important. It literally is, it can be, holy acts. Through work, says John Paul II, man participates in the activity of God himself. Thus the curse, as I point out, that through the sweat of your face you shall eat your bread, mysteriously also takes on the character of a gift. It's not just punishment. It's not just some sort of thing you have to go through. This gift is reserved to humans alone, as JP2 liked to talk about. Only humans work. Other animals don't. This is a uniquely human thing to do. It's reserved to humans. It distinctly ennobles us by allowing us to reflect through our activity the very action of the creator of the universe. Even our punishment, that we will have to earn our bread through the sweat of our face, has as its core and purpose mercy. Through work, God disciplines us for our good, that we may share in his holiness. That, of course, is from Hebrews 12:10. So, Catholic social thought, it's a big topic. Work lies at the center of it. These are a few reflections on what's important about work. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you. Ryan, could you try picking up some more questions? We picked up questions early in the talk, and the questions that came in were related more to the early part. So hopefully we'll have some others as well. Let me begin with a very broad question. The Catholic social tradition shows us work as a foundation for life in community, for human dignity, and so on. I guess I listen to this and I feel as though it must be looking in horror on our present situation, certainly the way economics go in this country. We have almost institutionalized chaos, constant, success in the economy seems to involve, huge amounts of disruption, loss of tradition, loss of community, and so on. So how would Catholic social tradition take us into that, either as workers, as citizens, as policymakers, in this present situation?
Well, that's an easy one to answer. I think the thing Catholic social thought tries to do with this is, first of all, to try to reorient us. What the heck are we doing all of this for? Now, this sounds like sort of a Leninist insight. The worse things get, the closer we are to the revolution. But in a certain sort of way, what one sees in American culture right now is, I think, the potential for a real rethinking about work. Every day, when I read the papers, read the economics press, etc., I see problems of people not going back to work because they're sick of the arrangements. I see 500,000 workers have struck in the past week. These are not led by unions. These are people walking out saying, for example, the fast food workers in Los Angeles today all walked out. They want different conditions. Congress has before it all sorts of bills that would completely redo our labor law. I don't think any of them at the moment have any chance of passage whatsoever. But this is a moment when I think most people are saying this can't go on any further this way. As Christians, we're supposed to be in the world but not of it. What the social thought tradition has to do with this is to say, all right, here's a series of ways of thinking about how we should organize work. And the first thing we ought to do is to remember our dignity as human beings. We are the center of work. So how are we going to organize life to allow people to have real lives? Gig work, etc. I mean, why are there marriage rates in the tank? Well, there are lots of reasons for that, but one of them is who can plan their lives anymore? If you're doing that sort of work, you can't plan from month to month. This will not sustain an economy. It won't sustain a society. It pushes people to the edge where they literally no longer participate in political life because they can barely sustain their own lives. This isn't sustainable. So here's a body of reflections on not a cookbook, certainly. The church has never tried to do that. Instead, it's tried to give us ways of thinking about big issues in a fashion where we can pick up those ideas, including what we really are, and move in a different direction. Lumen Christi Institute every couple of years has had a meeting of Nobel Prize-winning economists and cardinals. I've been at several of those meetings. They're very interesting. You want to see two groups talk across one another? There you got it. One of the problems is that economists have their own view, their own catechism of the way things work. And boy, they are invincibly ignorant, to use the theological term. That is beginning to fall apart because, of course, the notion that they have the human doesn't work. So I think that's some of what Catholic social thought can do.
Let me ask you a much more specific question. Why weren't natural associations like the family adequate responses to the radical? Let me get it closer to that. Why weren't natural associations like the family adequate responses to the radical individualism of the French Revolution?
Families don't exist on their own. They are everything in a social fabric is mutually conditioning. Families need to be grounded themselves. If you look at the sort of individualism we have, I mean, it's always been thought that this was a natural association. If it's so natural, why is family formation so very difficult in modernity right now? In almost every culture, family formation has declined to almost nothing. Tocqueville wrote a lot about individualism and what it would do in modernity, what it would do to a democracy. That's the quick answer. They are not self-sustaining. And that's one of the things that the early social thinkers could see almost from the beginning. That as you remove the other things that support family, they don't just live on their own. The decline of all social institutions occurs together. So if you look at the United States, in my field, a lot of people will talk about, well, union decline, and we need to change the law. If we change the law, that'll take care of it. Sort of magic thinking. Lawyers like that kind of thing. You know, if I've got this doctrine, we change the doctrine, that'll change. As Tocqueville said, mores are more important than the law. All of these things do condition one another. So you have to either look at the entire social setting or you're going to miss the point. These things are all connected. And if you don't have them, if they can't sustain themselves, it's not that there's one way to have a society. That's certainly not true. But you can never take just one institution and say, oh, that can exist on its own. It's not the way life works.
Self-determination. Does the goal of self-determination conflict with the goal of community building and solidarity? How does one potentially conceive of these goals as symbiotic?
That's a good question. You only become authentically self-determining if you've got the habits to do it. It's not something that happens automatically. I could teach a course at my law school that spends an entire semester just scratching the surface of exactly this question. So I'll give the 5-cent answer instead of the $5 answer, because we don't have time for more than that, and the $5 answer isn't sufficient either. But self-determination in the Catholic tradition means determining how you're going to be in light of what your end truly is, what that means, and how you're going to react in specific situations. You can't do that as an anonymous, unconnected being. You only can do that in the proper social setting. It's a little bit, we were talking about this with some students after class today. The United States in the last 30 or 40 years has, of course, engaged in some tremendously awful mistakes. Iraq. We went in there thinking that, all we need to do is essentially put up voting booths, and it'll look just like Vermont in a week. Town meetings, all this stuff. It's not the way things work. People need the habits to do it. They need the education to do it. They need the conditions under which they can do it. So self-determination is a complicated topic, but it is, the society is prior to the individual. And it's prior in two senses. First, you're born into a society, so if you're born into a screwed up society, your chances of being not screwed up are not as good. The second thing is society is prior in that it sets the conditions into which you're going to live. Society exists for the individual, and eventually, so the individual can be as humanly, reach that human potential and really engage in acts of self-determination, but you need a proper order in which to do it. It doesn't happen on its own. That's the quick answer.
All right, let's have one final question, and this, in a society without the need to labor, imagine such a society, what Christian virtues would be undermined? And I actually want to say this question comes in as a hypothetical, but I think we may be in the next couple of generations in this part of the world in a situation where, because of surpluses, automation, artificial intelligence, and so on, fairly large numbers of people may not need to labor in the way that's been seen before. So what effect would that have on the life of virtue?
Boy, I've been asked this question a lot when I've lectured in Germany, when I've lectured other places in the United States as well. As you know, some futurists and others have suggested that in the next 20 years, something like 40% of people will have no work. Well, that's going to be an interesting world if that's true. It's going to mean, amongst other things, finding a way to support those people. But nobody is going to be able to exist without a life of some sort of meaning. This, it seems to me, is again one of the things Catholic social thought can contribute, not in terms of a packaged answer. It doesn't suggest to do that. But if humans need work, we're homo faber, we're beings that create things. Dignified work to give life a real meaning. We need to do for one another. Work is this transitive thing. It creates solidarity. I think, Tim, that is going to be a major question for societies in the future. What sort of work, how it's going to be done, how we're going to recompense that. We have to remember that the society we're familiar with, this is only about 150 years old. Work was very different at another time. It's going to be very different in the future. We're in a transitional period. So the quick answer is people need work. They need meaning in their lives. We give our lives meaning through the sorts of work we do. Now, there are all sorts of things. We tend to think of work simply as market work, what economists call market work. That is, I do something, I get paid. But there's an awful lot of work that people do that isn't paid, but is enormously important. I think new ways of organizing that, new ways of calling on people to be able to use their talents is a real challenge for this society. I do think the social tradition has a lot of insights that will help direct that conversation and inform it.
Thank you, Tom. So, but before we part this evening, I wanted to extend a warm invitation to the first of our Sacred Music series, which is coming next week on November 18th, featuring Fauré's Requiem. It's here in the church and live streamed. At 4 p.m., Professor Thomas Kelly of Harvard and James Kennerly, the music director of the St. Paul's Choir School, offer a lecture with Q&A on the history, liturgical context, and musical characteristics of this beloved Requiem. At 5 p.m., we will have a special Mass during which the St. Paul's Choir of Men and Boys will sing the Requiem. So please join us either in person or virtually. And you can see harvardcatholicforum.org for information and online registration. Our Faith and Work series starts up again next semester on February 6th with a talk by Dr. Kevin Majors of Harvard Medical School on psychological skills and Catholic vision in work. Check out harvardcatholicforum.org for more information. And if you haven't done so, sign up for our newsletters to receive announcements about future events. Thank you again for joining in this conversation.